Welcome to this video on the Cinema channel. My name is Adisatguru, Buddha Rawa Bhagwan. Today's video is going to be called The State of the World by the Kalki Avatar. So in today's video we're going to talk about the challenges of the world and, what we can look at as we move forward in the days to come. Okay. Although this video, I'm going to throw a caveat out there, although this video might take a bit of a depressing turn for some, okay, listening to the state of the world, well, there is the good thing that I want to remember people on this channel, the listeners on this channel, that I have seen the golden age and that it does exist and it is a possibility for the future, not a guarantee. And it can last of many, 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 many thousands of years. But many, many thousands of years. But right now, everybody knows, I think, who's listening to this video. If you're listening in the present age, maybe this will have been solved in the future when you listen to this video. But right now, the world's got a lot of challenges, right? Now, we're seeing a lot of division amongst people in the world. Okay, we're seeing division within countries. We're seeing division between countries. Okay, so at this time in the world, the planet is divided in countries and nations, right? And we're seeing a lot of division between people, right? So that's taking different forms. Ideological division, political division, right? Where we also on this planet used to have a balance between democratic and autocratic states, right? We are now seeing more of a transition towards an autocratic system in many, many places of the world, right? This is not necessarily because the people don't want to govern themselves, but because their ability to have that decision in their lives has been reduced to a state where it'd be very difficult for them to get out of it. Basically, that means that, if you're in a dictatorship and you speak up, you might just disappear, right? Once someone takes power, if they're not willing to release that power and they spend all their time in power planning towards not releasing that power, well, then the odds are that person will stay in power, right? Except if, for example, there's a significant movement of the population which is stronger than the forces that have decided to side with that person who decides to stay in power, right? So often out of fear they will do this, or out of desire for enrichment or power, etc., right? But fear is a big motivating factor in any autocratic government. So we're seeing more and more a shift towards autocratic governments. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see a difference in everybody's daily lives, right? At the daily street level, whether you have someone that was elected that's governing the country or someone that's just going to keep power, except if the person who's keeping power is really doing bad things and you can't get rid of them, for example, the difference in a person's life is going to be relatively minimal in the connected internet age of today, right? Information is still freely flowing, but when you start getting into limiting information, then you might start seeing a difference, because as everyone was connected internationally with everyone through the internet, now you're seeing places that are starting to restrict internet access for some of their citizens, for example, right? Limiting what they can access. So basically, if you can control the information and the narrative, you can control essentially the whole process and how it takes place, right? And history as it's written moving forward as well, especially if you're teaching history and writing history. So we're seeing a shift, a move towards an autocratic system. Now remember that if you go far back, there was always that rare places where democracy existed. And then there was all the other places that had kings and emperors and all these things. So if you look back, the autocratic system is nothing new, really. You have someone that takes power at the top and all their close confidence and loyal people that are underneath, and the rest of the country that does their things, right? Now, So that's happening, right? That's one of the major trends. And, where we try to push the world toward democracy, unfortunately, the strength and iron of autocracy seems to have been stronger than the resolve of people in democracies and their resolve to die for freedom, basically. You know, Eventually you start making compromises in life, right? Compromise your freedom in this way, in this way, in this way, in this way, your liberties, right? But that's why, for example, in the United States, you have enshrined in the liberties, the right to carry a weapon, for example, where you go. In some places, you don't even have that right anymore to carry something to defend yourself on the street. So, if we're exceptions in some places as well, for example, of some practitioners, such as Sikh practitioners that have the kirpan, well, in many places you're not allowed to carry a self-defense item, right? You have to have a reason for why you're carrying it. So, I guess everyone can become Sikhs if they want to carry a blade, but yeah. So the world is going in a place where rights and freedoms will gradually erode, right? Where essentially the ones who will control the population are the rich, wealthy, and powerful, right? And specifically the ones who have the means to use overwhelming force against others, right? And unfortunately, that's how the world has always been. It's always been the law of the strongest. And what happens is with technology, everybody became more comfortable in their lives, and as information flowed freely, people became, what I would like to say, more educated, and more exposed to the world around them. And then that essentially made people, able to mobilize in certain ways that they might not have mobilized in ways before. So, there are many things like the echo chamber and all these different social media phenomenons where people are mobilizing and connecting in many, many different ways now all over the world, right? And basically any ways where large populations and people can connect is not necessarily in the best interests of an autocracy, right? In a democracy, it's great because it allows for free sharing of information. But in autocracy, you want to control the information flow. So when you have open information, such as the internet, that could lead to erosion, basically, of your iron grip over the population, right? Which is done usually through propaganda, right? And authority, fear and things like that, right? So these are the main things. So in autocracy, you probably want to just lay low under the radar as much as possible, when you're living in an autocracy. Or in democracy, it might encourage people to, express themselves and develop in ways that are less stifled in many ways as well, which can lead to different social phenomenon, etc. So it's an interaction between, the people govern the people, but at the same time, the people at the top, they like to keep the power. Right? They don't like to give it up after, especially if they've done things that other people could blame for them. So releasing power becomes very difficult. It becomes very difficult. And this is something that everybody kind of dreams a little bit. I want to be king, right? Or I want to be emperor or something like that, and stay at the top forever, and then give it to my children, for example, or something like that, right? So these are not new concepts, but these are concepts that have stayed, that are still with us in society, right? So democracies, are wonderful because, people can really be who they want to be, in a democracy with freedoms and rights and liberties and all these different things. And it's a great model for developing as well, commercially, and all these different things. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing a challenge to the commercial efficiency of democracies and capitalism, right? With the implementation of tariffs as a military tool in a way, essentially, right? A way of controlling other countries. We're seeing basically a world now where it's no longer free trade, right? And free trade's been dead for a long time, you could say. but it was still open trade. Now it's becoming a restricted trade, right? So even trade, even the ability to develop, right, to interact with the world market is being controlled now by tools, methods that are employed by nation states, right? So what is this? It's basically a constant interaction back and forth of reciprocity, going back and forth, reciprocal relationship between all actions and reactions, right? So it's all a big play of karma, basically. Karma is always the governing factor of all things. For all action, there is a reaction, right? So it's important to remember that, right? And the thing is, the reaction cannot be always anticipated or predicted. However, the action can be considered, right? So one should always consider one's actions, right? Because the reaction to one's actions is very difficult to foresee fully. So one must make at least one's best effort to make the best decision with the information that one has at hand, right? So the world is in a polarized way. Now what happens is you also have divisions not only at the level of states and nations, right, with autocratic leaders that are either friendly or competitive, right, depending on the local politics, right? If they even listen to these things anymore, depending how powerful they become as a leader, I guess. So what is the fear of an autocratic leader? To be overthrown, basically, that the population will come together and overthrow them. That's the fear, because they've decided that they won't relinquish power. So the fear is that the population will not accept that anymore. So what is their main purpose is to control the population so that that never happens, so that the population never rises up against them, right? So that's how you lead to continuations of regimes that last for many years. But then sometimes a set of circumstances, karma that could not be foreseen comes in, some things change, and then basically these things happen, right? Autocracies, dictatorships are known to fall, right? Are known to succumb in the end. And also, that doesn't mean that another dictatorship will not take over right after, but successive lineages of dictatorship or keeping power within families or even one individual over time will end. After all, that individual will die one day. So obviously it ends, right? There is a shift. There is still, even if people seek to retain power forever, they still die one day. So there's always a shift over time of these things and people who are in power, etc. Right? So sometimes you fall on bad people and you hope that the ones after are going to be better, right? You have to keep hope, right? Sometimes you fall on really good ones and you hope the ones that come after are not going to be bad, right? So it's all in the decision making that where it really takes place, those last minute decisions, those predictable decisions, those decisions for which you have less time to make your mind, right? That moment and of making that right decision when you need to make a right decision, right? For the good, not only of yourself, but all your people is what you'd hope for a leader, right? And when they stop thinking about the people, well, it often shows, and then one day the people overthrow them, right? If they can, right? If they can. So we're entering into a state basically where we're reverting back to autocracies, and democracies are going to end up on the minority side, right? But that doesn't mean they can't be very strong in their own right as well, but they'll have to be able to take action as efficiently as autocracies, right? So we now see basically a movement towards autocracy of different countries, right? We see a movement towards autocracy in the United States. But we also have many, many autocratic countries everywhere in the world. And we basically have some countries, we see in the United States some good things, some bad things, and we see that everywhere. Everywhere is the case for democracies and autocracies, right? So nothing is simple in this world. It's a complicated world with many moving parts, and actions can have vast consequences, right? Like they can have smaller consequences, you know? So the world is a shifting place always. Now we look at today and we say the world is on the edge, is basically on the edge of destruction, everything's going badly. So let's not remember that every era, every time has its challenges, okay? In a cyclical way. So for the people in other times and challenges before, they thought the same thing, that it was the end of the world and that everything was going badly, and maybe it was just because the crops weren't growing well that year. You know, so we have to put things in perspective to say that things are not worse in some ways than they were before. It's just that the scale of it has increased because there are more people than there were before, and the complexity has increased because technology has increased the complexity as well. So we are worse in some ways though, right? You know, there are many things that are worse now, but there are many things that are better now too because of technology, right? For many people who have access to that technology. Now, when you don't have access to that technology, it can make your life better. So technology's access and democratize free access is very important as well, right? For equal opportunity. But that's the thing, right? People don't necessarily believe in free and equal opportunity. You know, it's more of a survive and do what you can to survive and thrive world. You know, and survival's tough, and you're gonna have to work and get up every day. And if you can't find a job, you're in trouble. And if you lose your job, you can be in trouble. And you know, it's a tough world. You know, and it's like that in many places, except for people who are rich and powerful. And these are the people who have the power and who are never going to release the power, right? Because why would they, right? And there's different levels of power too. Some people think that they're really rich and that they have power, right? And they start getting ideas, but there's always someone on top, like the autocratic leader, for example, who's rich and powerful too, but also has the special forces, the secret police, the army, and all that stuff. And suddenly, the person who thought they were rich just because they had money, they suddenly lose everything. Just overnight, like that, if they got on the wrong side of the autocratic leader. You know, so it becomes a world of who's strongest and who reports to who and who falls under who. And basically, it's a kingdom system. Okay, it's a kingdom system. And as we advance further into the story, well, that's what we're going to kind of develop, that, you know, everything's going to kind of develop into little kingdoms, basically. Is probably what we're going to see, you know, that kind of movement. We'll maybe have some democracies that are going to survive and thrive and all these different things, but many places are going to develop into autocracies with a leader. And, you know, we take it for granted that there isn't a transition of power anytime soon, you know. That's something that might just happen. Now, there's another possibility that all these autocratic leaders are suddenly going to put down their power and walk away from it and stop controlling and trying to control information, all these different things. But why would they do that? It's not in their best interest, right? Because they're going to be subject to scrutiny after that by the new leadership, potentially, except if they controlled and established the new leadership. Why wouldn't they just keep it for themselves? So this is the reality of things. You know, as a democracies, we think that we have the best life and everybody wants this type of life and all these different things. But the reality of things is, you know, rights and freedoms and liberties, you have to fight for them every day. You know, the minute you stop being willing to put your life on the line every day for your rights, liberties, and freedoms is the day you lose them. It's that simple. You know, there is no compromise. To think that you're going to have to not fight for your liberties, rights, and freedoms because our ancestors did it and got our rights and democracies and all these different things, absolutely not. You have to understand that battle never ends and will never end. It's always a relationship between power, right, and the fair distribution of power between the group, right? So it's the control of power within a group or a small group of individuals, or we we make a vote and all decide together who gets in power, right? And in which way is really going to tell you what's going to be better for the future, for the people. Well, if the autocratic leader takes away the rights of their people, goes to war, does all these things, doesn't bring in prosperity and good life for people, doesn't protect the country, all these different things, well, then in that case, maybe it's not a good thing. But the same thing with a democratic leader, right? Same thing with a democratic leader. So these are all different things we have to basically consider. When we talk about these things, it's a relationship between the two, but let's remember that if we go back a couple of years, there weren't many democracies anywhere, but at the same time, let us not remember how the peasants suffered, right, under the monarchy before the French Revolution and stuff like that too, right? So many things have to be done well by an autocratic leader if they think that they're going to keep control and power, right? Now what happens is now we get into a state of new technologies which are emerging, such as drones and surveillance technologies and AI technologies of security and all these different things. So what we're going to see is it's going to become easier and easier, especially by controlling internet flows of information, for autocratic leaders to maintain power over a long time, right? And what we're going to see basically is everybody who's going to be very, very rich is going to be able, in a way, to kind of have their own place, their own kind of mini kingdom and their own land, right? Potentially even their own armies and forces, because drones, right, make it that physical forces are not even really that important anymore. Drones can do everything. So with a lot of money, you can now purchase yourself essentially military forces, and with land and all these different things can be purchased, right? So we might see a division of the world in kind of kingdoms, but before that, the nation state will reside as the main system of division of land, before it becomes more into a state of city-states and city nations, like we had prior to the establishment of nations a long time ago. So for it to return to city-states and city nations and all these different things, and the smaller nations, well, then that'll take a disintegration of the current nations in their current forms, right? So what could lead to that? The polarization of society, right? So if we have things like civil wars in countries and different things like that, this can lead to divisions of land within countries, right? As some control some areas and others control some areas, right? And all of this can definitely happen as well, right? Now we know that world leaders can not agree with each other and can get into conflicts and stuff like that, but we also have conflicts at all other levels as well. We have conflicts between individuals as well, so conflicts between races as well, right? We have conflicts between ideologies, conflicts between religions, conflicts between all these different types of ideologies or racial elements, basically, which can basically lead to other types of conflicts and civil war as well, right? We have conflicts between political parties, right? And in some countries, there's vast polarization between political parties, right? And some political parties would not like there to be another political party that could take power one day. So now we see basically utilizations of whoever's in power of technologies to alter the legislation, executive power, judiciary power of the country, so that they can stay in power, basically. We see these types of things happening. So in those types of countries, we see the democratic society moving towards autocracy. So we see that democracy is always challenged by the very nature that whoever's in power would like to stay in power and that their party stays in power. So we see that the very nature of democracy is challenged at its core by the concept that whoever's in power wants to stay in power, right? So it becomes, they have to be willing to come down and relinquish the power if the people want them out, right? And the minute you have an unchecked situation where someone who becomes in power is allowed to change the institutions so that they remain in power, The minute the population doesn't resist right away against that, they've already lost, because they'll just get worse and worse and worse in the quagmire, in the sand pit, in the quicksand of losing their rights and freedoms to have a right in who's going to be in charge of the group. Right? So the minute you see autocracy taking form, if you don't stop it right away as a democracy within your country, it will continue to take form, right? That makes sense. It'll continue to grow, right? And eventually the balance between autocracy and democracy ceases to exist. And that's a fine line to determine, as well, as there are autocratic elements in democracies as well, as there are in some cases some democratic elements in autocracies as well, right? So it's a balance between power and wanting to keep power, and basically, democracies are very vulnerable at their core, because it is the nature of many people to want to have power, accumulate power, grow in power, and keep power, right? This is not made better by the fact that there is a corruption at the level of the energy distribution systems of money technologies, an acerbic corruption of code, which makes that the technologies corrupt humanity. So humanity becomes corrupted, as they would basically kill their own family member or something like that for millions of dollars or something like that, Not necessarily everyone, but betray anyone in a business deal, or, corrupt their values for money, basically. When what they should be preserving and treasuring is their values and their integrity as a being of God, as a person, as a deva, right? For that is their real being and who they really are. Right? And there is, of course, a war between the devas and the asuras. So the asuras are enemy beings that send enemy code to corrupt your technologies, to corrupt you. And through these technologies of scarcity of resources, right, and control of wealth, and getting people to want to accumulate wealth and all of these different things, right? To live like kings, right? Well, because of that, now we live in a society where we have crime all over the place for wealth, and betrayals and muggings, and it's nice to be a rich person, but you can't even walk down the street with your Rolex because you might get robbed, by the crazy people on the corner there. Maybe they'll even follow you home and come break in, right? So the world is very, very complex. There are many moving pieces, many different actors, right? And it's a very uncertain world, right? But it always has been. If you were back in the days when you were living in castles with swords and spears, it was uncertain if you were in the field, if an enemy army would show up and kill you all, right? It was always uncertain. It was uncertain if there would be a plague, a pandemic, and everyone would die. Or if there would be a drought and no one would have enough food for the winter. Or storms that would take down the homes. So it's always been uncertain. Okay, in a way, we have more certainty today than we've ever had today. Okay, except that there are, like there have always been, conflicts in the world, right? But the thing is, we've now come to a world where people are so connected in this world that we don't want to see conflicts anymore in the world. And basically, through information communication systems, you hear about the conflicts, you're exposed in the conflicts, you see the pictures about the conflicts, everybody feels involved in the conflicts. And that's why you see protesters everywhere in the world, in different places totally of the world, protesting a conflict in another place of the world. Think about that for a second. They're in another place of the world because they're worried about another place of the world. I think that's a good thing. People don't want to see conflicts anymore. People don't want to see war. They want to see us go towards an enlightened society, right? And that's the other possibility for the future, right? That we go towards a golden age instead of an age where it's just autocracies and the rule of the strongest, and people vie for land and resources, and it becomes cutthroat and all of this, That's a possibility. We can go towards more and more conflicts in the world, more and more wars, or we could go towards less and less conflicts and less wars, you know? So what happens is now we lead to a situation where we have more chances for conflict in the world than we had recent years before. And that's because democracies, right, autocracies were less strong in recent years before. And as these autocracies became stronger, then their ambitions of the men on top became stronger, basically, right? As they felt their positions either diminishing or increasing, they decided, for example, to increase their territorial ambitions, or they decided to increase many different ambitions and to take many actions, right, that have led to more uncertainty in this world, right? More conflicts. And as they decide one day, maybe they grow old and they grow wise with time. Hey, that's a good thing. It's a good thing for anyone to grow old and wise. They decide maybe it's time to stop the conflicts. And then the conflicts end, right? And there are less conflicts in the world, right? So, however, in a modern age, modern technologies, conflicts can escalate very quickly and many people can die very quickly, you know? So it's best to de-escalate, right? And to essentially move towards less conflict in the world. Now, can we stop all conflict in the world? One day this is possible. But today, no. It takes time for all things to change, right? But we can put the pieces in place so that we can limit those conflicts in the future and that we can take the right decisions today to limit as much as we can today as well, right? So it's going to be a play, and it always is, between autocracy and democracy. You know, the rule of the people or the rule of the group on top, you know? And basically doesn't mean that it's the people that it's going to be better. You know, if you meet another group, are you going to be able to coexist and survive that meeting of that other group forever, or is there going to be a conflict eventually? And who's going to win, the rule of the people or the rule of the group on top of the other one, or the people on the other side? So it's always a play in those two things, okay? And creation has conflict always, okay? Because creation is a play of chaos and order, okay? And order is the good side, the white practitioners, the white magic, the good people. And chaos, those are the bad people, the dark side, okay? The dark magics. And the white city powers and the dark city powers are chaos, because they're chaos powers of city powers as well. Like there are order powers of city power. So it's always a play between the two, and it has been forever, since the days of the Flint Age. Okay, Flint Age technologies and all these different things. There were practitioners of chaos and practitioners of order. But the practitioners of order are basically the gods that walk the earth. Okay? And the practitioners of chaos are like the dark sorcerers and all these different things that walk the earth as well. So they're very powerful, but they're not as powerful as the gods. So in the end, order prevails. Life continues. Life exists. Life survives. The right decisions are made so that life survives. But chaos takes a toll too. And because of that little conflict between chaos and order, right? And order always pushing back chaos, but chaos always coming back in for another kick, right? That creates a movement, a dynamism between activity in all things, which pushes technology forward, which pushes everything forward, which pushes life forward, right? If there was no adversity in anything, right, life would not go forward. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we have to have a lot of adversity. We can keep it to a little amount, you know, the basic amount of adversity so that life moves forward, right? And that amount changes and fluctuates as adversity is not stable, it fluctuates. So we live in a polarized world. Polarization between populations, between nations, right? Between nation blocks, groups of nations, right? Between alliances. So it's basically an us versus them mentality, right? And that's often how it is in a world where power rules, right? And are we strong enough to resist them or discourage them from basically taking us on or dictating international policy to us, right? Now we've come from recent years where international policy has been dictated by one side, basically. And the other sides, well, they grew up, and they basically came to a power level where they said, now we can dictate international policy, right? So now we have different groups that are dictating international policy, which creates different narratives, right? With different intent and purpose, right? Which is always the acquiring of wealth, resources, power, stability, defense, all of these different things, all these fundamentals, right? Enough food, enough water, right? To keep growing, right? Everybody wants to keep growing as well, right? To keep building, to keep growing. So now we have different narratives trying to do the same thing and competing in an interconnected world for these things, right? So there's a competition between nations as there's a competition between individuals on the street. If you go apply on the job and 3 other people go apply, there's a competition between you. You're not nations, you're people. There's a competition. There's a competition for success, right? Because there's also the fear of being left behind, right? Of not succeeding, of becoming irrelevant, or even potentially being annexed, right? Completely, right? So in a world where, as it's always been, the rule of the strongest survives, when the strongest people decide that they are going to become bad guys, right? Well, the little guys have got to beware, so all the little guys have got to get together and gang up together to survive, or they hand over the keys to the kingdom, or they fall on their sword in a glorious last battle, right? So the glorious last battle is very noble and brave, but doesn't give you much, right? For the continuation of the stories of the people. But it is the glorious way, right? It is the glorious way. And giving up the keys to your kingdom, well, you could end up worse than falling on your sword, right? Or you could end up better. It's a little bit like a crapshoot, right? Or having foreseen all of that and having developed a wonderful army and defense and organization and financial system and all these different things in advance so that these things don't happen to you in the future, that's even better. So then you hope for the good leadership of whether it was democratic or autocratic of that nation and as it developed. See, as an avatar, I remember past lifetimes and past stories of different nations, and I remember autocratic nations falling, and I remember democratic nations falling. Okay? So it's important to remember that both can fall, like both can rise, like both can thrive, right? And thriving is not necessarily always seen the same way, right? So different nations have different narratives, right? And it's always based on their own narrative. So in a world where you have competing nations, you have competing narratives and competing nations, right? And in a world where information moves around, right? And countries and governments and leaderships are subject to the will of the people and the movements of the people, right? Whether it even be from an assassin, part of the people, well, in these ways, governments strive to control the information flow, right? As governments seek to control their borders, control tax collection for their people, control wealth generation and collection from their people, and seek to maintain the industries, the economy of their country. As a human being seeks to maintain their personal wealth, their personal bank account, their comfort at home, maybe even grow to a bigger home one day, maybe grow the family, all these different things. So we see the same at the micro level of the individual that we see at the macro level of the country, right? Or the organizations, right? Which seek to grow. And that's what we always see. They seek to grow, they seek to continue to live, continue to thrive, and as comfortably as possible, in an as secure as possible way for as long as possible, right? So that's what people seek: stability, wealth, prosperity, right? Security, and comfort. So we see competing narratives around the world, okay? And we see basically the militarization of trade as well, which we're seeing, okay? So basically, who do you allow to trade with, who do you not, and how much do you charge them to trade with you? And if they do something you don't like on the international stage, maybe you set higher tariffs, right? So a militarization of tariffs, right? Which is a way of using force, using strength, right? However, it's also a way of alienating the world against you. But realistically, if you're in a position of strength as a nation, you don't really care if you're alienating other people who are not in a position of strength. In fact, if they tell you strong enough that they're alienated for you, maybe they're a target for acquisition, right? So strength makes the day, right? And in today's world, in today's country, okay, we have an interesting dilemma where strength is determined by one thing: who has nuclear weapons, okay? So this determines strength in today's world: who has them and who can maintain them, okay? Because whoever has them and can maintain them, no one wants to mess with them, okay? So this is a defense for democracies as it is a defense for autocracies, right? And that's why you have autocracies, especially new autocracies, that seek to develop them as soon as possible, because they know that with them, no one's coming in to overthrow them, basically, or to take their land, because they have the kill switch button, which decimates any other country, right? So nuclear weapons are at the same time the most destructive weapons that exist, and we hope that there's never an accident or that they're never used. But at the same time, they are the greatest dissuasive force for someone thinking to invade a country. Because if that country has nuclear weapons and the means to use them and deploy them, you know that you're going to be losing cities if you go for them, So realistically, even if they have a smaller army, a smaller population, right, you don't really care for messing with them, Maybe we can play little minor trade games and stuff like that, but we don't really want to conflict with these people, because especially if they have a policy where if anyone invades them, they use their weapons, then who's going to invade them, right? No one's going to want to. So this is a good thing, especially in a situation where everybody has nuclear weapons. But when you're the ones who don't have any, you're in a bad place. Because historically, if we look back at the recent years, okay, all the countries that have been invaded recently are all countries that did not have nuclear weapons. And every single country that has nuclear weapons was not invaded. This is more than a coincidence, okay? This is much more than a coincidence. This is a fact. Okay, so it's basically showing you that the ultimate security for a country is to have nuclear weapons, right? Because it ensures basically that even if there's a little skirmish here or there at the border, no one's really going to try to take you because they know you'll use them, right? So they become a stabilizing factor between nations. Now the problem with nuclear weapons is if someone uses one by accident, if one is basically a government's overthrown and one's taken and launched, for example, a rogue way or something like that. The problem is once a nuclear weapon has been used by accident, it usually has a response nuclear weapon in a world where everybody has them. And that can lead to global total destruction, and it has before, actually. Okay? So that's the problem. But the thing is, until such a time as an accident happened, and especially if you make accidents cannot happen and you don't connect AI systems to nuclear launches and all these different things, then you have a good chance that the human safeguard mechanisms will stop any of these accidents from happening. And that's just how it is. Nuclear weapons stabilize the world. We had the greatest era of peace on this planet because of nuclear weapons, right? But at the same time, not everybody got them. So that led to wars, right? And some countries, you don't want them to have nuclear weapons because they're all in civil war. They're all messed up, right? So the nuclear weapons are going to get taken by someone, right? And then potentially used. So it gets scary at that point too. But for civilized countries that, that have a strong economy, that have developed countries, not have a nuclear weapon is basically criminal because you're inviting yourself, you're just showing your weakness, So in the future world, we will see a world where countries that do not have nuclear weapons are going to be much more easy to push around economically, militarily, etc., than countries that have nuclear weapons. For the nuclear weapons, basically ensure that you also have a final say in the negotiation. Okay? Without nuclear weapons, your words carry much less weight, and your borders are much less resistant long term, especially if you've got something that people want. So we enter a world where, because we're moving more towards autocracy right now, in a definite challenge to democracy, and maybe democracy will come back in its strength one day. Actually, in the golden age, it does, right? Autocracy falls to democracy very much in the golden age. And we don't forget the golden age. We started this talk saying that there are positives, and that the golden age exists as it is written in the story. And we can move towards the golden age, an age of enlightenment where there is on the whole planet no more than 5 murders in a whole year. In a whole year on the whole planet, think about that. And people live in an enlightened society that has moved beyond such limited concepts as accumulating wealth, right? That has moved to greater things. So basically, this future exists, right? However, it's a scary future when you're obsessed with wealth, or when you're at the top of the food chain, I guess, and you're the wealthy people and the powerful people, and you think that money makes a person, right? But not quite. So we enter into a world that is complex every single day when we wake up in the morning, right? Many different moving pieces and parts. Many different things are happening all over the world. Many different stories, right? And even different locas and parallel dimensions which are interconnecting and interpenetrating. So they're affecting each other in different things. And different beings working at the levels of different locas. So it's complicated, right? And in a more and more polarized world, right? It's normal that the world is more and more polarized. Another way of seeing it is that it just has people that are developed at different levels. If you go back before the days when technology allowed information to be more readily accessible, all types of different information from different sources, the internet, well, then the information of people mostly came from the people around them, right? And that made that people in one area, they all kind of thought the same way, had the same beliefs, etc., looked the same way, etc. But then people started mixing in a multicultural world, right? Where you had different races mixing with different races, different beliefs, different belief systems, different religions, etc. And a lot of the times the religions are saying that they're the only real religion, right? However, we know that all the religions come from God, right? And all of them have their validity and their truth, right? They're all part of the greater puzzle of understanding God. So many different ideologies, different ways of believing, of thinking, and thinking my way is the best way or the only way, right? Or I'm more powerful, so it's going to be my way, right? Or I want that land, so I'm going to take it, right? So it's a relationship between evil and good, order and chaos, right? And violence, right? And taking resides in chaos. And order is protecting and serving, right? So there's the relationship between chaos and order, between good and evil, right? And good always has to be on the winning side, but sometimes evil pushes it almost to the brink of the limit, right? So the world is in a complex place. With technology, polarization has increased, right? Because now there are different people in different areas of the world, all living beside each other, who all have different belief sets, right? All different identities and ways of identifying, even, and all different beliefs. So all of a sudden, we have all these different beliefs which are basically meeting each other every day, including people of different races, who look different, who act different, who dress different, who talk different, who think different, etc. All interacting. And this basically creates a polarized world where everybody thinks something should be done differently in a different situation, right? Or, everybody doesn't agree on what we should do in things in society, right? Or everybody thinks they should have their share or their opinion or their say, right? Where everybody's not happy if their share, their opinion, their say is not the one that wins in the end, right? So now we have all these different opinions and all that, and when a decision is made, only one group's suggestion or wanting how to do this can be implemented if there's different perspectives. So that creates potentially resentment at the level of the other groups as well, right? Different beliefs about how we should evolve society, how we should invest the wealth of society, what we should do. So there are different beliefs everywhere, and all these beliefs are interconnecting and meeting each other in the virtual online realm or in physical beings, people as they move about in the street in their daily lives, etc. So this leads to many incidents, for example, right? Especially when you have different people with different development of the mind and different more or less idle minds, right? Or people that are more and less ingrained in values and traditions, and which ones too, right? So we have situations where there are more and more uncomfortable moments, right? More and more situations where the terrain is not clear, right? So more and more decisions to make, more and more things to adjust for in society, right? More and more complex decisions, more and more complexity, right? And when you have more and more complexity, it becomes more difficult sometimes to maintain the structural cohesion of the whole, right? Because in the complexity, you can lose the structural cohesion, right? If you get lost in the complexity. So you need to adjust, right? You need to adapt, right? And that's why we have the tools of artificial intelligence, which are coming into the story as part of God's story, right? To help us adapt to a more and more complex evolving environment, and to help us adjust and react to everything that would destabilize creation. Now we have to use responsible AI. We can't let AI, for example, be empowered so that it can take over humanity or something like that, right? Or let it be corrupted in any way so that it no longer serves the humanity and it works against humanity. That's not acceptable. But if we use it well, it will allow us to adjust and calculate how we need to move our world forward to make it more and more efficient, or to actually just maintain its efficiency in an increased complexity of technology, right? An increased complexity of a growing population, in an increased complexity of a more complex world with more complex problems such as global warming, etc. Okay, so that's why artificial intelligence is coming in. Because it's the next step in our evolution to adjust to a changing world and to make our situation better as people. But we have to remember that it can't work against the population and take away jobs from everyone so everyone's poor now. No, if no one people don't need jobs anymore, well then tax the artificial intelligence jobs right? And pay the people with a universal income system, which I've talked about very often on this channel, which is the future, universal income. And people can still work if there are jobs to be worked, and there are, like medical jobs, etc., that still need to be worked. Pilots, for the beautiful vacations you're going to be taking, and people for to profit off the vacation industry business, and etc. But we have to move forward now in a way where no one gets left behind, right? And if we don't do that, well, it's difficult to go to the golden age. That's all part of the golden age, Now, in the meantime, in the short-term challenges, autocracies, problems like that, power games, people who want to keep power, people who are scared of change of power, people who are scared of movements of society, all of these different things, well, they're a barrier, right? That's what it is. It's a barrier. And you can say either the world and society will succeed to go to the golden age, or it'll fail. And I guess it'll be the end of the story at that point, right? So what do people want for themselves? What's more important? One group or person's power over society, or for society to live in a peaceful and harmonious way with itself and natures and other societies, right? However, let us not forget that there's always someone who's going to come knocking at the door. So it's important for society to not forget its warrior tradition, right? Its warrior lineages, and to keep evolving and being competitive in those ways as well. Now we get into a world where conventional warfare will be much different, right? Where it used to matter very much on how many soldiers you had. Now it'll matter more about how many drones you have, right? And how good they are, right? And as drones become more and more effective on the battlefield technologies, essentially drones become such superior weapons that conflict is no longer possible. Because if you have some drones on one side and you have the drones on the other side, once they've been unleashed, they're difficult to stop, so no one really wants to risk that, because you get into long protracted wars, or wars that are going to be over very quickly, if someone doesn't have their drones. So for conventional combat, drones are extremely effective, and the drone technology will continue to evolve and grow. And as we evolve and develop new technologies, such as anti-gravitational technologies and fast acceleration technologies, drones will become very, very, very effective. Okay, especially, they can be used in many different applications, just as simply as ramming into something with a drone that is indestructible, and having it ram into many, many different things in a short period of time with rapid acceleration. Drones can become essentially indestructible weapons that are very difficult to take down. Okay, drones can take down an entire civilization of a planet easily if you release strong enough drones to take down that population. Okay, so drones are very, 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 very dangerous weapons as well. But nuclear weapons are the stabilizing element, because if you can hit back with a nuclear weapon, no one's going to come challenge your border. It hasn't happened since people have had nuclear weapons. And this is a rule for the future as well. Because if it does, well, then we'll have nuclear conflict. That's it. And it'll be the fault of the people who decided to attack a country with nuclear weapons. They were retards, right? Oh, sorry, that's not a politically correct word. Sorry about that. Okay? So for countries that are developed, that are stable, right, if they want to protect themselves moving into the future, they should acquire nuclear weapons. Now, they don't have to advertise this to the whole world, but they should do it, basically, and have these. And if anything ever happens, then all of a sudden it's a good time to advertise it to the world, So moving into the future, power, strength means a lot, okay? And strength and power will come through technology, okay? Through weapons, through nuclear weapons, okay? Through ultimate weapons. This is strength and power, and the ability to maintain the financial system that supports those financial weapons, as well as all the other processes of the country or nation or state. Okay? Now, there is the possibility for breakdown of states, breakdown divisions of countries, civil wars, all of these different things everywhere in the world. Okay? Many different possibilities. And the irony of it is the chance of these things taking place is less in autocracies. So the more country is autocratic, the less the chance of a revolution, right? Of a civil war. And the more the country is democratic, If it moves towards autocracy, that's what triggers the risk. But once it has moved totally towards autocracy, the risk of a civil war diminishes, right? Because the autocracy crushes the civil war, right? Crushes the population and stops them from even having the possibility of doing such a thing, especially when they're armed with technology. So technology makes autocracies stronger, okay? And that's a very important thing to remember, right? So if you're going to have a democratic system, you have the wonderful life of a democratic world with liberties, freedoms, rights to assemble and have an opinion and have speech and identify however you want and all these different things. Well, you've got to be willing to put your life on the line every day to protect it. Okay, that's the difference. You know, you're at a disadvantage because technology makes autocracies stronger, right? However, it also makes you strong, right? And if you can get to a certain basic level of strength militarily with the nuclear weapons and with drones, all of a sudden, even if the autocracies are stronger in many ways, at controlling their population, you know, as long as you do a good job with your population and, you know, adjust with technology to all the shifts that you need to do to keep your population happy and keep stability of your country and the prosperity of your country and all of these different things, right? And with the work of your people, etc., well, then you can compete with autocracies. So life is better in democracies, but autocracies are favored, okay? Because quite simply, they use technology, right, to control their people in a much more military way, autocratic way than a democracy. So they can get things done very, very quickly that a democracy might not get done as quickly. However, there are some democracies that can get things done very, very quickly, right? But in the social cohesion of the democracy, especially if the democracy has polarizations that are very strong within it, it faces a disadvantage towards autocratic regime. However, life is better for people in a democracy. You know, they get to be who they really want to be. And an autocratic regime, well, who knows what's going to end up with you? You know, I guess the government will decide, right? The people on top. And it's better to be on the side of the people in power than not to be. But I guess that's the case in a democracy too, right? We just don't think about it that way. Connections always matter. So we enter into a world that is becoming more and more complex, right? And the only way to adjust to the complexity of this world is to use artificial intelligence. And that is why we are seeing a disintegration from an era of peace into an era now more of instability, with conflicts that have rearisen in the world. In Ukraine, we see the genocide that's taking place in Gaza. We see many, many different things that are taking place. Many, many things that are chaotic, that are evil, that are not right, right? And it's easy to blame the people that are causing it, but it's issues at all levels, right? It's issues because things are breaking down, right? Order is breaking down, right? And the solution to stop order from breaking down is to reinforce order, to reinforce all those mechanisms that ensure order, right? Because that's the problem. If you move towards a more autocratic system, autocracies are favored, right? And you could say that they maintain order in a very good way within their country. However, the problem is democracies might have more trouble maintaining order, but order is maintained for the right reason, right? So the challenge becomes stronger in a democracy, but it becomes in a way worth fighting for, where in an autocracy, order is more easily maintained within the autocracy, but the people would love to be in a democracy, right? Except if they've been totally brainwashed already. And this is the power of technology. The ability to control and modify an individual's mind. And now that new technological ways of connecting have been opened everywhere in the world, we see people's minds being modified by other people on a daily basis. People are becoming indoctrinated, people are becoming extreme in their views about certain things, even obsessed in their views. Totally obsessed. Okay? And because what happens is we now live in a world where everything is interconnected and there's so much stimuli and interaction with different thoughts and ideas that people's minds are being altered by these thoughts. Because many people have less developed minds able to resist the fluctuation of the mind from outside stimuli and maintain their inner calm and order in who they are, and not let themselves be modified or affected by outside stimuli, or influenced or encouraged, right? Or brainwashed. So information and ideas travel through technological systems, as do deities and spiritual beings. They also move through technological systems. So we live in a complex world. And some people get influenced by other things. And some people are more conscious of the things that try to influence them. And everything is trying to impose its influence upon you at all times in this world, as we also try to impose our influence upon the world around us. It is a give and take relationship between the story and ourselves, right? And this give and take relationship is a part of life, part of the processes of receiving and projecting and holding as well. These are also coincidentally the essential processes of developing Kundalini Shakti, the divine energy, the divine force of the yogis, to hold, to receive, and project that force to develop and grow as a spiritual being. So that relationship of interacting with the world, of interacting with creation, is what propels forward the growth of that creation. When one ceases to interact with creation, the growth also ceases. In this way, when we diminish trade, growth ceases. When we close borders, growth ceases. And also, growth is an important thing of creation, but it must be maintained at a sustainable rate. So if growth goes below a certain level, things cease to be sustainable. If things grow too fast, things cease to be sustainable. This is, for example, if you grow your population too fast, but you don't grow the housing fast enough, it's not sustainable. However, on the flip side, if your economy doesn't grow enough and your costs increase, you cease to be sustainable. So growth is an interaction that must be controlled, that must be guided, that must be maintained and preserved, that must be thought out. There are also some growths which are not necessary. Some would seek to grow the boundaries of their territory. And when leaders of autocratic regimes become in charge of a country, they might think to grow the territory of their country. This is of the side of chaos, for war is of chaos. And the autocratic leader that thinks instead, I must serve my people and let them have long life and happiness and joy and prosperity in their lives, and protect them as I protect in a way that of my neighbors and our neighboring nations. This type of thought is of order. The thought to harm is of chaos. The thought to protect is of order. So the state of the world is that we are moving into a complex time, more complex than before. But in that complexity, we can address all the problems of the world. If we can adjust and understand that complexity and technologically address it, we can remove the major causes of suffering on this planet and lead it to an age of peace and prosperity and stability for hundreds of thousands of years. But if we succumb to the bestial, more basic elements of our nature, instead of being sophisticated and educated and if we fall towards the sides of the animals, instead of being like men, and women, if we allow basic things such as rage, anger, resentment, fear to control us, instead of using logic and compassion and kindness and strength and honor, well, I think then we will fail ourselves. So I'd rather succeed. I'd rather for us all to succeed. And I think a lot of people are in my boat, in my situation, where they want everybody to get along in this world and to be better people, and for there to be safety and stability everywhere, and prosperity and wealth and happiness in families. So we enter into an interesting time where technology can fix all the problems of the world, or it can make them worse. And it will be important for humanity to remember that it's okay to be a little bit badass, but it's not okay to be a bad person. Thank you for listening to this video on the Zenware channel. This video has been The State of Things by the Kalki Avatar. Let there be peace, happiness, and joy.